Good evening. I'm going to begin with a few numbers. And I'm sure you may know this or you may not, but globally, 1 in 3 women will experience physical or sexual violence. But for Indigenous women in Canada, it's far worse. 6 in 10 have experienced intimate partner violence. 63% have survived physical or sexual assault. And we are 8 times more likely to be murdered by our partner. These are not statistics. They aren't just numbers. They're aunties, they're cousins, their mothers, their grandmothers, their daughters, their granddaughters. And they're our community. My name is Waneek Horn-Miller. I'm a Ganyankehaga, Mohawk Bear Clan woman. I'm a mother of 3. And I'm not a leader or a chief or a clan mother. I am an Olympian, a very retired Olympian. I was an athlete, shaped not just by sport, but I was shaped by survival. I am no stranger to colonial violence. At 14 years old during the Oka crisis, I survived being stabbed by a Canadian soldier in the chest while protecting my baby sister. I grew up in a family of very strong women, but just women. So I learned early to be my own warrior, to become the brother we never had, strong, intimidating when necessary, always alert, always prepared. But even with all that strength, the athletic power, the training, the vigilance, I was still raped. And there was nothing I could do about it. This is the truth for so many Indigenous women. Even when we do everything right, even when we are powerful and hyper-aware, we remain vulnerable to the violence that has been taught to this land. And my story is so common amongst Indigenous women my age, it makes me sick. Mohawk women once held political power, land authority, and influence. We had a society based on balance, and colonial governments saw that balance as a threat, just as they saw their own women as threats. And they targeted it and dismantled it. They legislated our identities, they stole our children, they controlled our marriages, they removed our ability to pass on who we are. I'm not sure if you know this, but Indigenous women are the only women in the world that can give birth to a child of another race. They sterilized Indigenous women. They still sterilize Indigenous women. It is still not illegal in this country to forcibly sterilize a woman. And they used our bodies for drug testing. Through all of this, they systematically stripped away our humanity, reducing us from people to objects that could be controlled, violated, and abused. And gender-based violence begins with dehumanization, with treating women as expendable. I was the National Director for Community Engagement on the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. And we found a very clear pattern. When resource extraction enters Indigenous territories, when man camps appear, violence, trafficking, and disappearance of Indigenous women rises sharply. Because in this country, Indigenous women have been treated like the land has been treated. Not as the sustainers of life or the givers of life, but as resources to be exploited. When the land is seen as expendable, so are its women. But colonial harm has wounded Indigenous men too. Before colonization, Indigenous men were protectors, defenders, guardians of peace. Colonial systems stripped away those roles, criminalized their righteous anger, and forced them into institutions built on the devaluation of women. The oppression, the control, the gaslighting, it created a pressure, a deep, justified rage. But they could not. They were forbidden to direct that rage at the real source, those colonial systems. So that rage turned inward, laterally, intergenerationally, and intimately. And this is why naming the roots matter. It does not justify it, but it is very important because once we expose the source, the behavior is no longer mysterious. It becomes visible. Visibility becomes interruptible. Interruptible becomes changeable. And during the inquiry, so many men told me this directly. I see so many women up here fighting for MMIWG. But we need more men, because if this violence is going to end, it will be men who end it. Men holding other men accountable. Men stepping back into the role of warrior, protectors of women and children. But now there's a new threat, and that's the manosphere. Today's boys, including Indigenous boys, are shaped not by elders and culture, but by this manosphere, the digital world built on misogyny, dominance, and entitlement. Once again, Indigenous masculinity is under attack. The manosphere is trying to recolonize our boys, pulling them into this hyper-aggressive version of manhood that was never ours. Indigenous masculinity has always been balanced, humble, protective, respectful, and responsible. Real strength never needs to dominate. It stands beside powerful women and is stronger because of them. When I chose my partner, it wasn't conscious. It was instinct. My spirit recognized his safety before my mind did. Yes, he carries a very strong masculinity, a 4-time Olympian in judo in the 220-pound category, and now a doctor. But his masculinity is nothing like the insecure dominance that the internet glorifies. His strength was disciplined, not controlling, grounded, not aggressive, protective, not possessive. He was powerful. He is powerful. And his power made room for mine. It made me feel safe in a way that I had never known. Men like my husband are drawn to strong women because they know women are the backbone of our families and our communities. A strong man, like my husband and I, we are trying to teach our son, our 12-year-old beautiful son, how to become a man in this world. We constantly say to him, nothing excuses violence. But understanding where harm comes from is important, but it does not justify it. It does not erase accountability. If we want healing and balance, we must see it, name it, and take responsibility for how we act. How we feel is not our fault, but what we do with those feelings is where accountability lives. This cannot be, when I think about gender-based violence and Indigenous people, it cannot just be Indigenous people fighting for change. When I think of gender-based violence and women and gender-diverse people across Canada, it cannot only be their voices screaming that this is a crisis. Because gender-based violence, it's targeted, it's intentional, and it's been used for generations as a tool for warfare and colonization. And when I think about what I have to ask here, is if we are going to fight gender-based violence, we have to be even more targeted, even more intentional, and even more powerful. And what I have to ask Canadians, especially the heterosexual white men like my husband, who hold the power, I need them to ask themselves, what does it mean to be Canadian? If being Canadian means that, half of the population has to live in fear, that Indigenous women are more likely to go murdered and missing, if that's what it means to be Canadian, then that's a huge problem, and we will never be the country that we aspire to be. But if we can finally say that being Canadian means that every person of every gender, identity, and nation is safe from violence, with no exception, and no hierarchy, and no acceptable losses, then we can one day be that country we proclaim to be. And I want to end with the thing I tell my son every single night when I hug him. I'm scared for our boys, just as I'm scared for our girls. I hug him, and I tell him that every small act of protection, every quiet moment of kindness that he gives, every gesture of gentleness that he shows the women and the boys around him, but especially the girls, helps rebuild a woman's trust in the world. And if all of our boys do this, then one day the women can perhaps slowly lower their weapons of defense and believe again in a future where she is safe and where gender-based violence is finally a thing of the past. Thank you.